Please marry me. Mail order bride begs a caged mountain man everyone feared, and this happened to dust of Foul Ridge had its own taste, bitter as spent gunpowder, dry as old bones. Eleanor Hayes knew it well by now. For 3 straight days it had followed her, in her hair, on her tongue, in the creases of her gloves, since the stagecoach had rattled away and left her standing alone at the edge of this godforsaken town with nothing but a carpetbag and a promise turned to ash. She'd come from Ohio chasing that promise. Samuel Morrison, the man who'd written her letters full of dreams and sunlit acres, had promised a new life on good soil, near clear water. She'd sold everything for it. Her mother's Bible, her wedding china, even her pride. The last thing she sold was her fear of starting over. But when she reached Morrison's claim, there was nothing, just a patch of empty land, some trampled weeds, and townsfolk who shrugged when she asked after him. Gone 2 months now, they said, maybe 3. That was all the explanation anyone gave. Now she stood among them again, shoulder to shoulder with the same faces that had looked away when she asked for help. The town square was crowded, not from kindness or curiosity, but the darker pull that draws people to hangings, shootouts, and train wrecks. But this gathering wasn't any of those. It was something colder, a quiet spectacle. At the center of the square stood an iron cage, 8 feet tall, 6 feet wide, bars thick as a man's wrist, blackened by sun and rust. It looked less like a cell and more like a monument to fear itself. Inside it sat a figure, motionless, knees drawn up, head lowered, arms chained to the floor. Eleanor shaded her eyes against the glare. Even from 20 feet away, she could see the iron had baked hot in the afternoon sun. The air shimmered around it. God help whoever sat inside. The prisoner's clothes hung in tatters, gray with dust and dried sweat. His hair was long, matted, hiding most of his face. How long's he been in there? A newcomer asked beside her. 3 weeks come Tuesday, someone replied. Sheriff Bradley's keeping him till the circuit judge rides through. What did he do? A pause. Then a voice low and wary. Killed a man up in the mountains. Maybe more than one. They say he went wild after what happened to his family. The words rippled through the crowd like a shiver. Eleanor leaned forward, studying the man again. He didn't look wild. He didn't move at all. The stillness about him wasn't animal. It was deliberate, almost reverent, animal's paced. This man sat as though carved from grief itself. A harsh voice broke the murmurs. Move along, folks. Ain't nothing more to see here. Sheriff Bradley's shadow stretched long in the dust. His badge caught the light, glinting sharp and cold. The crowd obeyed, grumbling, peeling away toward saloon doors and shade. But Eleanor didn't move. She'd seen cruel men before. Her father, her late husband, both had carried that same hard look in their eyes, that quickness to strike when the world refused to bend their way. This man in the cage, he didn't have that look. His stillness was not defiance, nor malice. It was surrender. The sheriff noticed her lingering. Ma'am, he said, move along now. Is he fed? She asked. What? Food. Water. Is he given any? The sheriff's face reddened. Course he is. We're not barbarians. Now kindly step back. But Eleanor didn't step back. What's his name? Don't have one he'll give us. Bradley snapped. Ain't spoken a word since we brought him in. Wouldn't talk to God himself if he asked. Then maybe he just needs someone to ask him kindly, she said. The sheriff laughed, a coarse, joyless sound. Lady, that man's feral. We found him living like a beast in a cave. Took 6 men to drag him out, and 1 near lost a finger for the trouble. Eleanor studied the prisoner again. His wrists were raw beneath the iron, the skin scabbed and swollen. Dried blood traced his temple, the mark of an old wound that hadn't been cleaned properly. Why keep him caged like this? She asked softly. Because that's what he is. A woman nearby, the baker's wife, spat in the dirt. They found bones in that cave. Human bones. Belonged to the Garrett family. Went missing last winter. You asked me. That thing and there's no man at all. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Bones, she repeated. You saw them? No, but then you're repeating talk, not truth. The woman's mouth twisted. You're not from here, miss. You don't know the kind of evil lives in these hills. No, Eleanor said evenly, but I know the kind that lives in men's hearts when fear tells them stories. The sheriff's hand fell to his gun belt. That's enough. But Eleanor wasn't done. She took a step closer to the cage until she could smell the scorched iron and the faint odor of sweat and blood. Sir, she said quietly, can you hear me? The man didn't move. Do you have a name? She tried again. Can you tell me what happened? Nothing. No twitch, no sound, not even a breath she could see. She turned back to the sheriff. You said he killed Tom Garrett? Found him standing over the body, blood on his hands. Bradley said, that's evidence enough. Was it self-defense? The sheriff's jaw tightened. Don't matter. Tom Garrett was a respected man. Had a wife and 3 children. This creature took him from... Eleanor looked back into the cage. The man's eyes were hidden behind the fall of dark hair, but something about his posture, the quiet of it, pressed against her chest. What will happen to him? Judge will hang him, most likely. Some folks are a skin for worse. The sheriff spat tobacco into the dust. Eleanor swallowed hard. She'd heard that same cold logic before. In Ohio, after her husband was shot in the back over a land dispute. The law had said there wasn't enough evidence then, too. Now she was standing in another dusty town, hearing the same tune play again, different instruments. She reached into her carpet bag and felt a small cloth bundle tucked inside, her last possession of worth, her wedding ring. She kept it not for sentiment, but for survival. Something to trade when times grew desperate. Times were desperate now, but not in the way she'd imagined. Sheriff Bradley, she said, her voice steady as the dry wind. I want to make you a proposition. Bradley frowned. Ma'am. Eleanor lifted the ring, the gold dull beneath its layer of dust. This man needs someone to speak for him, someone to take responsibility. The sheriff squinted. What in God's name are you talking about? She turned to face the crowd that had drifted back, drawn by her defiance like moths to fire. You all believe in justice, she called. In the law, don't you? There were murmurs, uncertain, suspicious. Then you must believe in mercy, too, she said. And redemption. She held up the ring. I'm offering to marry this man. The square went dead silent. Then someone laughed, sharp, ugly. Another followed, until the sound rolled like distant thunder. You gone mad, woman? Someone jeered. Must be the son. Eleanor didn't flinch. If he's truly the monster you say, then I'll be the one to pay for it. But if he's not, if you've caged an innocent man, then at least one soul in this town will have acted with decency. She looked back at the prisoner. His head had lifted slightly. Through the veil of his hair, she caught a glimpse of his eyes, gray as winter storms. They met hers for only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat she saw it. Not madness, not cruelty, but the hollow ache of a man long past hope. I'm sound of mind, she declared, and I know what I'm offering. Bradley's face turned the color of raw meat. You don't even know his name. Do you? She shot back. The sheriff had no answer. You've kept him caged 3 weeks without trial, without even knowing who he is. Eleanor said, voice rising, where I come from, that's not justice. That's cowardice dressed up as law. Murmurs rippled again, some angry, some uncertain. A tall man pushed through the crowd. Marcus Garrett, brother to the murdered man. His face was red with fury. That animal murdered my kin, he shouted. Tom went up to check his trap lines, and this beast slaughtered him like a hog. Were you there? Eleanor asked quietly. What? I said, were you there to see it? Garrett faltered. I didn't need to be. We found Tom's body not 50 yards from that cave, blood still on this savage's hands. Any witnesses? Eleanor pressed. Anyone alive who saw what happened? No, he barked. In the mountains. The only witness is that thing in the cage, and he won't talk. Eleanor turned to the prisoner again. Sir, she said softly, did you kill the Garrett family, the women and children? The crowd leaned forward. The man's shoulders rose once with a deep breath. Then, slowly he shook his head. The chains rattled like distant thunder. He's lying. Garrett roared, surging forward, but two men held him back. He didn't speak, Eleanor said evenly, but I asked him a question and he answered. I choose to believe him. Bradley snapped. That's enough, lady. You're meddling where you don't belong. Where I belong, Eleanor said, is wherever justice has been left to rot. Her words hung in the hot air like the toll of a bell. The crowd began to shift, doubt flickering behind their suspicion. It was the first crack in the wall of fear this town had built around itself. Even if I agreed to this madness, Sheriff Bradley said, trying to recover his authority, we'd need a preacher, and Reverend Walsh won't marry a man like him. Then make it civil, Eleanor said. You've got the authority. I won't, then I will, came a new voice. An old man limped forward to the ring of onlookers, Judge Patrick O'Brien, his white beard bright in the sunlight. Sheriff, open that cage. Judge, you can't. I can. O'Brien cut him off. And I will, unless you plan to explain to the circuit court why you held a man without formal charge and denied him a lawful bond. Bradley cursed under his breath, but fetched his keys. The crowd surged back, murmuring in alarm. The lock turned with a heavy click. The door creaked open. For a long moment, no one breathed. The prisoner rose. He was taller than Eleanor expected, shoulders broad even beneath torn fabric. His bare feet were bleeding. His face, when the hair fell away, was hard and strong and terrible in its exhaustion. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes, met hers again. The shackles stay on, the sheriff muttered, until he's out of my town. Eleanor stepped closer, her heart hammering so loud she was sure they could all hear it. I, Eleanor Hayes, she said clearly, take this man as my lawful husband, to have and to hold, for better or worse, from this day forward. Judge O'Brien raised an eyebrow. And you, sir, do you consent? The man hesitated, then lifted his shackled hands, pressing his palms together, a gesture that might have meant prayer, or surrender, or maybe both. The judge nodded. Then, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife. The sheriff spat in the dust. God help you, lady. Eleanor took the ring she'd held and slipped it onto the man's smallest finger, the only one it would fit. He flinched at her touch, then stilled. The crowd watched, silent now, the laughter gone. Eleanor turned to them, her voice calm and proud. You all sleep easy tonight, she said, knowing you'd have hanged a man who couldn't speak to defend himself. I'll take him now. The law, as you keep reminding me, says a wife is responsible for her husband. Bradley's jaw clenched. You've got until sundown to be out of Foul Ridge. And God have mercy if you bring him back. Eleanor lifted her chin. We'll be gone before the light fades. She gathered her carpetbag and started down the dusty road, not looking back. Behind her came the slow shuffle of chains, the sound of a man half free, half condemned. At the edge of town, she stopped and turned. Sheriff Bradley and his men stood watching. The crowd lingered like vultures. You said the shackles come off when we leave, she called. When you're well away, the sheriff replied. Send them back with the next traveler. Otherwise, I'll come collect myself. Eleanor nodded once, then faced forward again. The sun was sinking. The mountains waited ahead, jagged silhouettes against a red sky. Beside her walked a man she had just married, his chains clinking softly, her ring glinting faintly on his finger. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Two souls bound by desperation and something that might, if tended right, become salvation. Behind them, Foul Ridge shrank into shadow, taking its cages and cruelty with it. Before them stretched the open country, wide and silent, a wilderness big enough to hold both ruin and rebirth. And so began the legend of the woman who spoke to a cage. They walked until the last breath of daylight drained from the sky. The road west from Foul Ridge was little more than a wagon scar through sage and sand. Wind rolled over flats, tugging at Eleanor's skirt and whispering dry secrets through the brush. Beside her, the man who was now her husband kept pace without sound except for the soft, ghostly clink of chains. Each step made that faint metallic music, reminding them both what freedom still cost. When the darkness thickened enough to hide the trail, Eleanor stopped near a clutch of juniper trees. Their twisted shapes offered a meager windbreak and the promise of firewood. "We'll camp here," she said, setting down her carpet bag. The stranger, her husband, stood a few paces off, watching her as though waiting for permission to exist. The stars were coming out above him, sharp and cold. In their light, she could finally study his face. Beneath the grime and weeks of neglect, the features were angular, fine-boned. His mouth held a quiet sadness rather than cruelty. But his eyes, when they met hers, carried a weight that made her catch her breath, storm-gray and fathom-deep. "You can sit," she offered gently. "I'm going to gather some wood." He shook his head once, a sharp motion, and strode into the dark scrub himself. The shackles limited his stride, yet he moved with the silent confidence of a man long used to hardship. Within minutes he returned, arms full of dry branches. He crouched and arranged them with practiced precision. Larger logs at the base, kindling nestled for air. When Eleanor struck a match, he motioned her back and produced 2 stones, striking sparks until one caught in the grass nest he'd built. The fire took, crackling to life. "You've done this before," she murmured. He didn't answer, only fed the flames until warmth pushed back the desert chill. Eleanor unpacked what little she had, a small blanket, some hardtack, dried beef, a half-filled canteen. She spread them out between them, an offering, a truce. The man studied the food, then vanished again into the night. For a heartbeat panic prickled her. Had he run? Was the town right? Then he returned, moving as quietly as shadow, carrying prickly pear fruit cupped in his hands. Kneeling by the fire, he scraped the thorns away with a flat stone, then held one out to her. She tasted cautiously. Sweet, cool juice against a throat raw with dust. "Thank you," she said. He gave a small nod and prepared another, his movements measured, almost delicate. The chains clinked softly, marking each motion like the ticking of some slow clock. They ate in silence. When she tried to push more of the meager rations toward him, he shook his head until she insisted. Only then did he take a little more, chewing slowly as though relearning the habit of eating beside another soul. When the meal was done, Eleanor drew out a tiny sewing kit. "Those clothes won't last another day," she said. "I can mend what I can in this light." He looked down, plucking at his torn shirt. Beneath the rip, firelight glinted on a map of scars, old burns, clawed slashes, long-heeled bullet furrows. He hesitated, then sat cross-legged, turning his shoulder toward her. She stitched quietly, aware of the careful stillness in him, the way he held himself rigid so the needle wouldn't prick. Through the rent she glimpsed not violence, but survival, proof of a man who'd fought to stay alive in a world that offered him no mercy. "You survive a lot," she said softly. He gave the faintest motion of agreement. The needle slid through cloth, the fire popped, and far off a coyote called. Under that lonely sound Eleanor began to speak, not to fill silence, but to bridge it. "My husband, my first husband, was named James," she said. "He was gentle, too gentle for the kind of men who wanted our land." She told the story in pieces. How James had been shot while plowing, How the sheriff back home had called it an accident even when the bullet came from a rifle only one man owned. How she'd sold the farm for half its worth and left Ohio with nothing but Morrison's letters promising new beginnings. The man listened without moving, his eyes on the fire. When she finished, he looked at her, and in that look she saw understanding. Not pity, but recognition, as though her grief echoed something he carried inside. "I know you have a story, too," she said. "When you're ready, I'll listen. But I won't press. We both had enough of people demanding things from us." She tied off the last thread. "There. Not pretty, but it'll hold." He examined the stitching, tracing the seam with a finger. Then he gestured toward her carpet bag. Eyebrows lifted in question. "You want to see what else needs fixing?" she guessed. He shook his head, pointed to the frayed handle. "Ah." She handed it over, using his teeth and bound hands. He worked the leather free, rethreading it with patient skill. When he returned it, the handle was stronger than new. "You're handy," she said. "A craftsman?" He paused, then held up his palms to the firelight. Calloused, scarred, marked with the familiar burns of forge work. He pointed to the fire, mimed hammering. "A blacksmith," she breathed. He tilted his hand side to side. "Close enough. Maybe a farrier, maybe both." She watched him draw a horseshoe in the dirt, then embellish it with tiny decorative curls. "You were an artist," she said quietly. He hesitated, then wiped the drawing away, as if the memory stung. The fire burned low. The desert wind slipped colder. Eleanor spread her single blanket on the ground near the flames. "There's room for two if we keep close," she said. "You'll freeze otherwise." He shook his head hard, gesturing that he'd stay apart. "Prop or not, I won't have you catching cold." She laid down, patting the space beside her. After a long moment, he relented, settling at the very edge, his back to her, chain links whispering as he tried to find a way to rest. Eleanor watched the line of his shoulders, the rigid posture of a man, and used a trust. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. He flinched violently. The blanket slid half away. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "Didn't mean to startle you. The shackles, they must hurt." He lay still for several breaths, then slowly eased back under the blanket. When she rested her hand lightly on his sleeve again, he didn't pull away. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "we'll find a way to take them off." Sheriff said send them back, but he never said they had to stay on till then. A soft exhale answered her. Agreement, maybe, or disbelief. Above them the stars glittered fierce and near. The fire cracked, then settled to glowing coals. Eleanor stared into that red-hot heat and thought of all she'd burned away to get here. Fear, sorrow, the timid woman who'd boarded a stagecoach hoping for rescue. Now there was only this quiet, this man beside her, and the long, unknown road ahead. "Jacob," she whispered experimentally, giving him a name she'd chosen earlier in her mind. Jacob Stone, strong, steady, carved from sorrow and survival. "If you can hear me, I'll keep my word. I'll see you free." He shifted, turning just enough that the firelight caught his profile. Then, with that same gesture of palms pressed together, he answered his silent promise. They drifted into a half-sleep, two strangers under one threadbare blanket, the wind singing low through the junipers. Somewhere out there a coyote answered another, and the sound was less lonely than it had been. Dawn bled over the horizon in pale rose and gold. Eleanor woke to find the blanket pulled up around her shoulders and Jacob gone. Panic jolted through her until she saw him by the fire pit, crouched over his chains. He'd found a rough stone and was grinding at the lock pin, slow and steady. "Let me help," she said, sitting up. He shook his head, kept working. His wrists were raw and bleeding where the iron had rubbed through the night. She fetched her tin of salve and a strip of cloth. "Please," she insisted. This time he paused, letting her clean the wounds. The skin was scored deep, the kind of damage that came not just from metal, but from years of binding, physical and otherwise. Up close, she saw more scars across his palms. Tiny burns from forge work, a few puckered bullet marks along his forearm. The history of a hard life written in flesh. "These are old," she murmured. "You've been at your trade a long time." He nodded once, eyes unreadable. When she finished, he resumed his filing. The rasp of stone on metal filled the morning. It was strangely soothing, the rhythm of freedom being earned one patient stroke at a time. After an hour, the first shackle gave way with a dull click that seemed to echo through the emptiness. Jacob stared at his freed hand as though it belonged to someone else. Then he attacked the second lock with renewed fury. When it, too, broke open, he stood, breathing hard, the chains dangling. He lifted them, stared a long moment, then swung them against a boulder again and again until the links bent beyond use. Each strike rang like a bell tolling the death of something dark. When he was done, he hurled the twisted metal into a ravine and stood trembling, chest heaving, eyes bright with release. "Better?" Eleanor asked. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of something almost like peace. He reached out, took her hand briefly in both of his, warm, solid, grateful, then let go. They ate in silence, then began walking again. Without the chains, he moved differently. Stride longer, body uncoiling with each mile. Now and then he ranged ahead, scanning the horizon, always circling back to her side. The morning sun climbed high, bleaching the land in gold and white. By noon they reached a ridge where the trail forked. One branched south toward civilization, the other west into the high country. Eleanor shaded her eyes. "Which way, Jacob?" He studied the horizon, then pointed toward the mountains, toward solitude. "West, then," she said. "Always west." They started down the new trail. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain, and behind them the world they'd escaped grew smaller until even its cruelty couldn't follow. That night, they camped beside a dry creek bed. Jacob built a fire again, while she gathered stones for a ring. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had shape now, like a friendship still being forged. When the fire burned steady, Eleanor spoke, voice soft under the stars. "I don't know where this road ends," she said, "but I know I'd rather face it beside someone who still knows how to build a fire." He looked up, surprised, then smiled, a faint, careful thing that transformed his face. The first true smile she'd seen. In that moment, she realized he might not be the only one learning freedom. She was, too. They sat until fire sank low in the desert night wrapped around them. Two souls stitched together by chance and courage, listening to the quiet breathe of the land. And far off, beyond the black line of the mountains, something like hope waited. By the third morning, the mountains began to rise ahead, great ribs of stone catching the sun like old bones. Between them lay valleys streaked with cottonwoods and thread-like creeks. It was wilder country than Eleanor had ever known. No fences, no wagons, no sound but wind and the far cry of hawks. Jacob walked a few paces ahead, leading the way with the sure instinct of someone who belonged to silence. He stopped now and then to study the ground. Hoof prints, old wagon ruts, the shadow of a trail half swallowed by sage. Each time he gestured for her to rest in shade while he scouted ahead, always returning with that same quiet nod. The path was clear. By afternoon, they crested a ridge. The land below opened wide and green, startling after days of dust and ochre. A narrow river coiled through a small valley dotted with cottonwoods and wild grass tall enough to sway like waves. Eleanor drew a breath of wonder. "It's beautiful," she said, half to herself. Jacob shaded his eyes, scanning the valley with that soldier's alertness that never left him. Then he pointed, far off near the creek, a faint shape of logs half buried in brush. The ghost of a cabin. Eleanor's heart gave a jolt. "Morrison's claim," she murmured. "That must be it." They made their way down the slope, boots sliding on loose gravel. When they reached the valley floor, Eleanor saw the truth. The so-called homestead was little more than a start, for log walls without a roof, an open doorway yawning like a wound. Whoever had begun it hadn't stayed long enough to finish. She stood in the doorway, looking at the emptiness. He never built it, she said quietly. All those letters, all those promises. Jacob said nothing, but his gaze softened. He touched her shoulder lightly, then pointed the surrounding land. Good soil, clear water, plenty of timber. Then he mimed the motion of a hammer, questioning. "You mean finish it?" she asked. "Build it up again?" He nodded. Eleanor let her eyes wander over the landscape, the broad fields sloping toward the creek, the pines climbing the hills, the faint scent of rain in the wind. This could be home, she thought. If courage counted for currency, she could buy the whole valley. "I have $17 to my name," she said, half smiling. No tools, no roof, no neighbors. Jacob crouched, scooped up a handful of soil, let it run through his fingers. Then he pointed to himself, then to her, then around the land, the sky, the beginning of a cabin. Together, her throat tightened. "You'd help me build it? After all this?" He drew in the dirt with a stick, a small house, smoke curling from its chimney, 2 stick figures beside it. Then he looked up at her, with a question in his eyes. "A home," she whispered. He nodded. For a long moment, Eleanor couldn't speak. Then she knelt beside him and whispered, "Yes, let's make it real." Jacob's answering smile was fleeting but real. He rose and began examining the structure with the careful eye of a craftsman, testing the joinery, tracing where the beams should meet, judging which timbers had rotted. The way he moved, measured, intent, reminded her of a man who'd built before, who'd once created not just shelter, but beauty. Then something changed. His posture stiffened. He froze, staring at the half-built walls as though they'd become ghosts. The blood drained from his face. "Jacob," she asked softly, "what is it?" He didn't answer. He walked to the creek, hands clenched, breathing hard. Eleanor followed at a cautious distance. When she drew near, he turned, eyes haunted. He pointed back toward the unfinished cabin, mimed hammering, then drew a line across his throat. She frowned. "Building death?" He nodded, trembling slightly. Then he stooped, gathering pebbles. 1 large, 2 small. He placed them together, then surrounded them with many others, forming a circle. With his hands he mimed violence, stabbing, striking, then pressed his palms over the small stones, burying them under dirt. Understanding struck her like a physical blow. "Your family," she breathed. "You lost them." Jacob's head bowed. The silence between them deepened, filled with everything words could never carry. She knelt beside the little mound of stones. "How?" she whispered. He added another stone, slightly apart, a woman, and cradled in his hands before setting it down. Then he pointed to the woman, to the 2 small stones, to himself. "Family." He gestured outward, raiders, many of them, then back to himself, fighting, surviving. And finally, to the buried stones gone. Eleanor's tears came without shame. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "So damn sorry." Jacob sank to his knees by the water, hands trembling. For a long while they stayed that way, the only sound the creek murmuring past and the wind sighing through reeds. At last he wiped his face with a rough hand, stood, and looked back at the cabin. He pointed to it again, then to himself, then covered his face with both hands. She pieced it together. "You tried to build again, and they stopped you." A nod. "The town, Foul Ridge. They feared you because you wouldn't speak. They thought grief was madness." Jacob touched his throat, where faint rope scars traced pale lines. Eleanor's stomach turned cold. "They tried to hang you," she whispered. He nodded once, slow and heavy. Eleanor reached for his hand, hesitated, then took it anyway. His fingers were cold, scarred, trembling. You don't have to build for them, she said, but maybe you can build for us. Something new. He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes eased just enough for breath to pass between them. They spent the afternoon in wordless work, clearing the cabin's interior, stacking usable logs, salvaging nails from Morrison's abandoned supplies. Jacob moved with purpose again. She fetched water from the creek and washed the dust from her face, feeling it lift some invisible weight from her soul. As twilight fell, they made a fire inside the half-shelter walls. Jacob arranged stones into a hearth, testing their fit until they interlocked perfectly. Eleanor spread pine needles and old blankets to make a sleeping corner. The scent of resin and smoke filled the air, something warm, almost homely. When she glanced over, Jacob was sitting on a log, a piece of charcoal in hand, sketching on a flat stone. He worked with surprising delicacy. When he finished, he offered it to her. It was a simple drawing, a woman standing before a half-built cabin, looking not backward but into the open valley. "It's beautiful," she said. He pointed to her, then to himself, then to the cabin, then tapped the drawing. "This is home," she guessed. He hesitated, then drew breath and spoke. The word came rough, broken, like the crack of a door unused for years. Home. Eleanor's heart clenched. The single word carried so much: pain, hope, defiance, prayer. "Yes," she said, voice shaking. "Home." The next days settled into rhythm. Morning sun gilding the valley, the smell of sawdust and fresh-cut pine. Jacob showed her how to notch logs, how to set them with strength. She learned to lift with her legs, to tie simple braces from rope and vines. At night, they sat by the fire, muscles aching, sharing food in silence that grew comfortable. Sometimes she caught him watching her with that quiet curiosity of a man rediscovering the world. Once, as she brushed her hair by the firelight, she felt his eyes linger, not with hunger, but with the simple awe of someone remembering beauty. They added a roof by the end of the week, rough but sturdy. Jacob fashioned hinges from scrap metal, shaping them to fire and hammering them against stone. The clang of it echoed through the valley, a sound both primal and hopeful. Creation reborn from ruin. On the 10th night, rain came. A soft, steady fall that pattered against the new roof and soaked the earth until it smelled alive again. Eleanor lay awake listening, smiling when she realized no water leaked through. Jacob's craftsmanship held. She looked over at him. He slept near the fire, one arm flung out, face softened by exhaustion. In sleep he looked younger, almost peaceful. She whispered, "Thank you," knowing he couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the world washed clean. Steam rose from the soaked grass. Jacob stood outside sharpening a piece of iron into a crude axe head. He worked bare-armed, and she caught the ripple of muscle beneath scar. Strength, not brutality. Power turned toward creation. They ate breakfast, flatbread and dried meat. Then Jacob pointed to the mountains, tracing a line with his finger as if planning something. He drew in the dirt again, a barn, a corral, a garden patch. Eleanor laughed. "You think big." He gave a modest shrug, eyes glinting. That evening, as the light faded to rose, they sat side by side watching the sky catch fire. The mountains glowed red, then purple, then sank into shadow. Eleanor thought of her first sight of him, caged, broken, mute, and marveled at the transformation. The same man now built walls to shelter instead of imprison. "You know," she said softly, "I think God forgave you long before this town will." He looked at her sharply, then away, uncertainty flickering. "I mean for surviving," she added. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to forgive ourselves for." He nodded once. The gray in his eyes looked less storm and more sky now. When the night chill crept in, they went inside. The fire glowed low, painting the new walls gold. Eleanor lay down, and Jacob settled near the doorway, as he always did, part guardian, part exile. She wanted to tell him, He didn't need to keep watch anymore, but something in his posture told her he still carried ghosts that prowled the dark. So she let him keep his vigil, and she slept soundly for the first time in years. At dawn, the valley woke to birdsong. Eleanor stepped outside, stretching sore muscles. Jacob was already at the creek, washing. When he straightened and turned, sunlight flashed on his wet skin, and she felt a warmth that startled her. Not desire exactly, but the dawning awareness of something living quietly between them, waiting to grow. He caught her watching, and for once he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, small, cautious, real. Eleanor smiled back. That day, while gathering wild herbs near the creek, she found a patch of blue lupin pushing through the wet soil. She picked a handful and carried them back, placing them in a tin cup by the window. The little cabin suddenly felt more alive, more theirs. Jacob noticed and nodded approval. Then, on a scrap of wood, he carved a single word with the point of his knife and set it over the doorway. Stonehome. Eleanor traced the letters with her finger, her throat thick. That's what this is, isn't it? She whispered. Built from stone and stubbornness. He smiled again, the faintest hint of pride in it. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt anchored, not a land or law or promise, but the shared labor of two people who'd both been broken and decided to rebuild anyway. The valley echoed with their hammering and laughter, with the hiss of rain and the quiet murmur of the creek. And somewhere within those sounds, a story began to take root, one the world would someday call legend. But for now, it was simply theirs, a woman and a once-caged man, building a home out of dust, grief, and grace. Autumn light came sharper in the high country. The mornings bit cold, and the ridges above the valley glowed red with turning aspens. Eleanor rose early each day, kindling the fire while mist still lay thick along the creek. Jacob would already be outside, splitting logs or shaping with his hammer and makeshift anvil. His movements carried that steady rhythm she'd come to rely on, metal ringing like the heartbeat of their new world. They'd been at Stonehome nearly 3 weeks when Eleanor faced the truth. If they meant to survive the coming winter, they need real tools: saw, nails, tar paper, flour, salt. The wilderness gave much, but not everything. Cedar Falls lay a day's ride north. Jacob drew a map in the dirt, showing the narrow canyon trail that led there. He pointed to her, then to the valley, shaking his head. "Stay. I'm coming," she said, crossing her arms. "I need cloth, and I won't have you facing that town alone." He frowned, but when she met his gaze with the same stubborn steel he'd seen in her before, he relented. He fetched the mule they'd bartered for from a passing peddler, an old, gray creature named Bristle, who seemed as opinionated as the humans guiding her. They set out at sunrise, the air brisk and sweet with pine. Eleanor rode. Jacob walked ahead, leading the mule. He insisted on that, his silent way of saying that if trouble came, she'd have a chance to flee. The canyon walls rose high on both sides, painted crimson and gold by morning light. It was quiet except for the echo of hooves and the occasional whisper wind through rock. Around noon, Bristle stopped dead, ears twitching. Jacob froze too, his head lifting like a wolf catching scent. Then Eleanor heard it. Hooves. Behind them. Fast. Jacob motioned her to the side of the trail, leading mule and woman both to a small widening where they could stand clear. He moved forward, placing himself between her and the sound. 3 riders appeared around the bend, dusty, hard-eyed men. The one in front reined up sharply. Eleanor recognized him at once. Marcus Garrett, the brother of the man Jacob had been accused of killing. Well, Garrett said, his voice carrying easily in the canyon's echo, "Ain't this a sight? The beast and his bride." The 2 riders behind spread out, cutting off escape in either direction. Their horses stamped nervously, picking up on their riders' tension. "We want no trouble," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "We're just passing through." "Trouble?" Garrett laughed. "Lady, you married trouble." You think we're letting him walk free after what he did?" Jacob stood motionless, hands at his sides. His knife hung at his belt, but he made no move toward it. Eleanor saw the faint tightening of his shoulders. Readiness, not aggression. Garrett's gaze flicked to her. "You know what he is? What he done?" "I know enough," she said. "I know your brother came to his camp armed." Garrett's face darkened. "You calling my kin a liar?" "I'm saying he went looking for a fight and found one, and this man defended himself." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Self-defense? That's a fine tale. You sure you didn't buy yourself a killer to match your temper?" Eleanor felt Jacob shift beside her, the faint scrape of boot against stone. His body blocked hers completely now, a wall of quiet protection. The gesture filled her with both fear and pride. "Step aside, woman," Garrett said, hand dropping to his gun. "You don't need to die for him." Eleanor swung down from the mule and faced him square. "He's my husband. His fight is mine." The canyon went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. One of Garrett's men, a wiry fellow with a thin scar across his jaw, spoke up uneasily. "Marcus, maybe this ain't—" "Shut up, Dale," Garrett snapped. Jacob's hands lifted slowly, palms outward. No threat, only plea. Then he reached under his shirt and drew out the small leather cord he always wore. Hanging from it was a tiny carved horse, smoothed by years of touch. He held it up toward Garrett. Then, with deliberate motions, he pointed to himself, then mimed cradling a child, then laid a hand over his heart. Garrett frowned, thrown off balance. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eleanor's voice softened. "It means he lost family, too. Children. A wife. Raiders took them. He knows grief as well as you do." "Don't you use my brother's death for sympathy," Garrett growled, but his voice had lost some of its venom. "You think killing him will bring Tom back?" she said. "Or will it just make you another man haunted by ghosts?" For a long moment, Garrett didn't move. The only sound was the soft rattle of Bristle's bridle and the slow drip of water somewhere down the canyon. Then Dale spoke again, quiet but firm. "Marcus, Tom was hot-headed. You know it. He went into those hills mad and half drunk, looking for somebody to blame. Maybe he found what he went looking for." Garrett's jaw worked. He looked from his man to Jacob, still standing with the carved horse held out like an offering, and something broke in his face. Not forgiveness yet, but the start of it. "I should kill you," he said hoarsely. "Lord knows I've dreamed of it." Jacob dropped to one knee, pressing the little carving into the dust before him. Then, with one hand, he drew in the dirt a rough picture of two men, one fallen. He pointed to himself, then covered his eyes. Regret. Garrett's throat moved. He stared at the drawing, at the tiny horse, at the silent man who looked more human than any monster. Then he turned his horse sharply. "Get up," he said roughly. "Get up and take your woman out of here. If I see you again, I might forget mercy. But not today." He spurred his horse forward. Dale hesitated just long enough to nod at Eleanor, almost respectful, before following. The third rider went last, glancing back uneasily as they disappeared around the bend. For a long time, neither she nor Jacob spoke. The canyon seemed to exhale, wind stirring loose pebbles. Then Eleanor's knees gave out, and she sat heavily on a rock. Jacob crouched beside her, concern etched deep in his eyes. She managed a shaky smile. "That was brave," she whispered. "Kneeling like that, showing him sorrow instead of rage." He touched the carving at his chest, then looked at her with a question that was almost wonder. How had she known what he meant? She simply squeezed his hand. They stayed that way until the adrenaline faded, until the canyon felt like stone again instead of danger. Then Jacob stood, helped her up, and together they led the mule onward. By the time they reached Cedar Falls, the sun was sinking. The town was smaller than Foul Ridge, but livelier, its main street lined with false front buildings and the smell of fresh sawdust from a nearby mill. Eleanor felt eyes on them as they passed. Curious, wary, some openly hostile. News traveled fast across the territory. She suspected the story of the woman who married the wild man had arrived long before they did. They stopped at the general store. A bearded man behind the counter froze when Jacob entered. "I heard about you, too," he said cautiously. "That business down in Foul Ridge." "We need supplies," Eleanor said, setting silver coins on the counter. "We'll pay fair price and cause no trouble." The man studied the coins, then her steady gaze. After a moment, he began to gather what she listed: flour, salt, nails, tar paper, kerosene. Other customers whispered, but kept their distance. Jacob stayed near the door, shoulders slightly hunched, trying to take up less space. A small girl, no older than 6, peered around a barrel at him. Her mother hissed for her to come back, but the child stepped closer, holding out a penny. "Mister," she said, "your mule looks tired. This is for carrots for her." Jacob blinked, startled. Slowly, he knelt. Instead of taking the coin, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something carved from wood, a tiny bird, smooth and simple. He offered it to her. The girl gasped with delight. "Oh, it's beautiful." Her mother approached warily, then softened when she saw her daughter's joy. "Thank you," she said to Jacob, voice trembling between fear and gratitude. He nodded and stepped back. The little girl ran to show others her treasure, and a murmur went through the store, not of ridicule, but wonder. The Beast of Foul Ridge, carving toys for children. When Eleanor finished paying, they loaded the supplies and left town under the softening gaze of dusk. As they rode out, she said quietly, "You changed something today." Jacob shook his head, embarrassed, but she saw him touch the carved horse beneath his shirt, as though reminded of what it meant. To protect, not destroy. They reached the valley by the following evening. Smoke curled from their hearth as Jacob rekindled the fire. Eleanor unpacked the supplies, humming softly. The cabin smelled of fresh-cut wood and safety. Jacob came in carrying the last crate, paused and looked around, at the walls he'd built, the roof that held firm, the woman who had given him a second life. He smiled, faint but real. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like distant voices, and the sky blazed with stars. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Eleanor felt the weight of fear lift. She looked across the fire at Jacob, who was mending a broken latch. His hands, those scarred, steady hands, moved with purpose. The man once caged like a beast now rebuilt the world with patience and quiet grace. When he looked up, she met his eyes. "You saved us today," she said softly. "In that canyon." He shook his head. Then, after a pause, he pointed to her, touched his heart, and spoke one word, still gravel-rough but clear: "Courage." The sound of it filled the small room like a blessing. Eleanor reached across the table, took his hand, and held it for a long time. Outside, night gathered over Stoneholm, and somewhere beyond the dark ridges, the story of the beast and his bride began to change into something else, something truer. A story of blood and dust, yes, but also of mercy in the slow, stubborn rebirth of 2 wounded souls who had decided, against all reason, to build a life. Winter came early to the valley, soft at first, frost feathering the grass, creek edges rimmed with silver, but soon the storms began to roll down off the peaks, carrying the smell of pine and snow. By December, the mountains wore white crowns, and Stoneholm crouched beneath them like a stubborn miracle of wood and smoke. Eleanor rose before dawn each morning, banking the fire, kneading bread from their dwindling flour. Jacob worked outside until the hammer of his anvil became part of her heartbeat. Steady, patient, the sound of life continuing. Each night they sat by the hearth, the air between them warmer than the flames, though they still spoke little. Words had grown unnecessary, glances, gestures, Quiet smiles did the talking. They'd built more than a cabin now. Jacob had added a shed beside it, part workshop, part refuge. He never told her what he was making in there, only that it was something that needs doing. Sometimes she'd hear the rasp of a saw long after dark, and see the glow of lamplight through the cracks. He'd come in late, tired but peaceful, the kind of tired that comes from creation, not survival. Eleanor didn't pry. Some silences, she'd learned, were sacred. One gray afternoon, when wind drove snow sideways across the valley, she heard distant hoofbeats. A voice called out above the storm. "Mrs. Stone, it's Dr. Morrison. Got someone here needs help." She opened the door to find the elderly physician, half supporting a young woman heavy with child. The girl's face was as pale as the drifts, lips trembling with pain. "Found her on the road," the doctor said. "Wagon axle broke. Husband rode ahead for help, but with this storm coming, she couldn't wait." "Bring her in," Eleanor said, clearing space near the fire. "Lay her down, quick." Jacob appeared at once, eyes taking in the scene. Without words, he stoked the hearth higher, fetched water, clean linens, anything the doctor needed. Eleanor saw the flicker of memory in his face, the old pain of watching a woman labor, the ghost that hovered behind his eyes. But his hand stayed steady. "What's your name, dear?" she asked the girl. Sarah Winters," came the answer between breaths. It's too soon." "Maybe not, dear," Morrison said briskly. "You're strong. Let's keep you that way." The cabin turned to a world of light and shadow, of heat and gasping breath. Eleanor moved as if guided by instinct older than fear, heating water, wiping sweat, murmuring comfort. Jacob stayed near the fire, ready with whatever was needed, his silent presence anchoring them all. Hours blurred. The storm battered the walls, but inside there was only the ancient rhythm of struggle and hope. At last a cry pierced the night, not of pain but of life. A baby's cry, strong and insistent. Eleanor's knees gave out in relief. "A girl," the doctor announced, smiling through exhaustion. "Healthy lungs, healthy mother." Sarah Winters sobbed and laughed all at once as Eleanor placed a tiny bundle in her arms. The child's dark hair clung to her head, her fists no bigger than sparrow hearts. Jacob stood motionless, eyes shining in the lamplight. Eleanor saw him touch the carved horse at his chest, lips moving in a silent prayer. Then he stepped forward and placed another log on the fire, as if feeding warmth to this new life. "She's perfect," Sarah whispered. "We'll call her Hope." Outside, wind howled around the cabin, but inside, the name seemed to still it. By dawn, the storm had passed. Sunlight glimmered on snowdrifts piled against the windows. The air smelled with smoke and new beginnings. Dr. Morrison dozed in a chair, his spectacles askew. Eleanor brewed coffee and handed him a cup when he woke. "You've got the hands of a midwife," he told her. "Could use more like you in these parts." Eleanor smiled faintly. Just did what had to be done. Jacob was by the fire, carving something small from a scrap of pine. When Sarah stirred, he crossed quietly to her side and offered the carving, a tiny cradle holding an even tinier child. Sarah's eyes filled. "It's beautiful. Thank you." Jacob nodded once, his expression soft but unreadable. Then he stepped back, giving her space, his own memories flickering behind his eyes. A few hours later, the door burst open again, this time with laughter. A young man stumbled in, half frozen, snow to his knees. "Sarah," he cried, "I found the doctor," but his words stopped when he saw his wife alive and the baby in her arms. He fell to his knees beside them, overcome. "You did it. My God, you did it." "Tom Winters," Dr. Morrison said mildly, "you're just in time to see what your wife did all the hard work for." Tom Winters grinned through tears, then turned to Jacob and Eleanor. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't owe us anything," Eleanor said. "Neighbors help neighbors." Tom looked around the sturdy cabin, at the solid joinery, the well-fitted hearth. You built all this yourselves? Jacob nodded modestly. You ever think about hiring out that skill? A man like you could find steady work with the homesteaders up valley. Jacob's brow furrowed, half curiosity, half uncertainty. Eleanor touched his arm. Maybe that's worth considering. Tom nodded eagerly. I mean it. Folks need barns, fences, tools repaired. You'd have no shortage of work. Jacob glanced at Eleanor, and she saw the flicker of hope. A craftsman needs his craft as much as breath. The Winters family stayed 3 days until the road cleared. During that time, the cabin filled with the warmth of human noise. Sarah's laughter, Tom's talkative cheer, the baby's tiny cries. Eleanor caught herself smiling for no reason, stirred by a sweetness she'd thought long dead. For Jacob, it was harder. More than once she found him standing by the cradle, eyes distant, remembering other small hands that would never reach for him again. But when hope fussed, he would lift her gently and rock her with the easy certainty of a man who had once been a father. On the third morning, Sarah pressed Eleanor's hands in farewell. We'll come back, she promised. You'll always have friends up the mountain. Tom clasped Jacob's forearm. You ever need an extra hand, you know where to find me. After they rode away, the cabin felt emptier, but not lonely. The echoes they left behind filled the place with something new, purpose. That night, Eleanor woke to find Jacob gone from their bed. The fire still burned low, and she followed its glow to the workshop. Through a crack in the door, she saw him sitting beside the finished cradle, Hope's cradle twin, his rough fingers tracing the carving. His shoulders shook once, quietly, and then he whispered something she barely heard. Forgive me. Eleanor slipped away, leaving him that private moment. Some grief, she knew, only lessened when shared with ghosts. The next morning, he showed her the cradle properly. It was a masterpiece. Oak polished to honey, roses carved along the sides, smooth rockers that moved like breath. I started it before the storm, he said, voice rough from disuse. Didn't know why then. It's beautiful, she said, touching the roses. Will it be for the Winters baby? He hesitated. If she needs it. Or if, someday, the words trailed off, but she understood. They both did. Jacob, she said softly, I don't know if I can carry children. After James died, there was, she paused, steadying herself, a loss. The doctor back, he said maybe again, maybe not. He looked up quickly. Doesn't matter, he said, the words firm. We build other things. Homes, work, kindness. Eleanor's throat tightened. In that moment, she saw how far he'd come, from the man who was behind silence to one who could speak truth without fear. She reached out, covering his hand with hers. Together, then. He turned his palm upward, lacing their fingers. Together. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes that clung to the roof and melted against the windows like whispered blessings. Winter settled in earnest. Jacob's reputation spread faster than the snowdrifts. Were the quiet craftsman who could fix anything reached Cedar Falls. When he returned to town for supplies, the stares were fewer, the greetings warmer. Mr. Henderson at the general store met him with a nod. Could use help here if you're looking for steady work, he said. $1.50 a day, and you keep what broken goods you can mend. Eleanor, standing beside Jacob, saw the hesitation in his face, the old fear of crowds, of judgment. She squeezed his hand. You should take it. Henderson hesitated, glancing between them. He don't talk much, I hear. He don't need to, Eleanor said. His work speaks plenty. Before the storekeeper could reply, the door banged open and a young woman entered, helping her elderly father. The man's cane had split in two. Mr. Henderson, the daughter began, can anyone fix this? Jacob stepped forward, took the cane gently, and examined the break. He motioned for permission, then moved a counter. With practiced ease, he cut a clean joint, bound it with metal bracket and leather wrap, and handed it back within minutes. The old man tested it, astonished. Better than before. How much do I owe you? Jacob shook his head. Henderson, watching in disbelief, said quietly, "No charge, Mr. Brewster. Consider it goodwill." When they'd gone, he turned back to Jacob. "Start Monday." Eleanor smiled. "Told you." Jacob managed the faintest grin. Work changed him. 3 days a week he stayed in Cedar Falls, mending wagons, shoeing mules, fixing tools. Folks came to trust a silent man who never cheated, never cursed, never refused help. When he returned home each weekend, his hands carried the smell of iron and pine soap, his eyes a quiet pride. Eleanor filled the days with her own labor, sewing curtains, tending the small garden beneath snow, writing letters she never sent. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, trading stories not in words but in comfort. The rhythm of frontier life stitched them together tighter than vows. Sometimes, when the wind was low and stars burned clear, Jacob would speak softly, slow, deliberate sentences, his voice still raspy but stronger. "I used to think I was cursed," he said once. "Now I think maybe I was being shaped." Eleanor looked at him through the glow of lamplight. "By grief?" "By mercy," he said. "Yours." She said nothing, only reached for his hand. He laced their fingers and, for the first time, kissed her palm, a simple gesture that felt like the world turning right again. Spring was still months away, but in the heart's warmth the scent of new life lingered. The cradle stood in the corner, empty yet full of promise. And when the storm winds howled across the roof, Eleanor would whisper into the flickering light, half prayer, half gratitude, "Thank you for sending him to me." And somewhere in the dark, Jacob would stir, understanding even without words, because this winter, more than any before it, had brought them something neither had dared believe in again: hope. When the first thaw came, it came fast. Snow melting in silver sheets off the pines, the creek turning wild with laughter. The valley smelled of mud and life again. Buds swelled on the cottonwoods, and everywhere the earth seemed to breathe after its long sleep. Eleanor stood on the porch of Stonehome, hands on the rail, watching sunlight spill across the meadow. The air carried that raw sweetness only spring can give, a mixture of sap, smoke, and beginnings. Inside, Jacob's hammer rang slow and steady as he finished the final hinge for their new door. She smiled. "That sound become our church bell," she called. Jacob looked up, eyes bright under his dark hair. "Then service runs late today," he said, voice rough but warmer than she'd ever heard it. They both learned to speak more, he with words, she with patience. Silence still lived between them, but now it was companion, not warden. A week later, a rider brought mail from Cedar Falls. Among the folded notices was an envelope marked in a hand Eleanor hadn't seen in years, her sister's. She sat at the table while Jacob worked nearby, turning the paper over in her fingers before breaking the seal. "Eleanor, word reached us of you, of a marriage, of a life out west. Mother's gone now and the farm is sold. I have thought of you often, though I never understood your leaving. If there's forgiveness needed between us, take it. If you ever wish to come home, there is room with me in Cincinnati." Rebecca Eleanor read it twice. The words stirred old ghosts, the smell of river fog, the sound of church bells, the life she'd fled after James's death. Home, her sister called it, but the word didn't fit anymore. Jacob watched her face. "Bad news?" She shook her head slowly. "No, just another road I won't take." He waited. She rose, crossed him, and handed him the letter. "She thinks I need to go back," she said, "but everything worth going back for is already here." Jacob read silently, lips moving over each word as if tasting them. Then he set the letter down, met her eyes. "You could," he said, "if you wanted." "I don't," she answered simply. "I spent half my life chasing promises that broke. I'd rather keep one that holds." His hand brushed her cheek, calloused and gentle. "Then we'll make sure it does." By mid-April, the valley saw its first traveler since winter, Sarah and Tom Winters, their baby bundled in bright cloth. Hope had grown round-cheeked and curious, reaching for everything that glimmered. Eleanor swept them into the cabin, laughing. "You brought spring with you." Tom set a small crate on the table. "Payment for the cradle, and for saving my family." Inside were seeds, corn beans, squash, and a bolt of blue calico. Eleanor's eyes filled. "You didn't have to." Tom grinned. "A gift, then. Besides, I couldn't have built this without Jacob's drawings." He nodded toward the shed, where Jacob had laid out plans for barns and corrals on rough parchment. Sarah looked around the room, smiling. "It feels alive here, like the walls listen when you talk." "They do," Eleanor said softly. "They were built with truth." Hope gurgled at Jacob, waving tiny hands. He chuckled, a sound so rare and rich it startled even him, and took her carefully. The baby patted his beard, squealing. Sarah blinked away tears. "She doesn't do that with anyone else." "Babies know hearts," Eleanor said. "They see better than grown folk." For 2 days the Winters family stayed. They helped plant the first rows of seed, shared bread and stories. When they left, Hope's cradled twin remained by the hearth, a symbol of what mercy could build. After they rode out, Jacob watched their wagon vanish down the ridge. "Good people," he murmured. "The best," Eleanor said. "And because of you, they still have each other." He turned to her. "Because of us." That evening, as dusk melted gold into violet, Jacob fetched a small bundle from the workshop and laid it on the table. Inside rested the twisted iron shackles he'd once worn, the same ones the sheriff had ordered sent back months ago. He'd kept them hidden, half forged into something else. Now, in his hands, they were reshaped into a horseshoe, polished bright, engraved with one word. Eleanor traced the letters with trembling finger. "You turn your chains into luck." He smiled faintly, maybe into truth. They decided to ride into Foul Ridge the next morning, to return the symbol, to close the circle. Eleanor packed provisions. Jacob saddled Bristle, who complained as always but obeyed. The ride took half a day. Spring had softened even the harsh outlines of that town. New paint on the saloon, flowers by the church steps. Yet the cage still stood in the square, rusting in the sun, forgotten. Eleanor dismounted, walked to it, and laid the horseshoe inside. "For whoever needs it next," she said. "May they find freedom, too." Sheriff Bradley emerged from the office porch, older, slower, but still watching everything. He stared, recognition dawning. "You." Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "Us." Jacob stepped forward, silent as ever but unflinching. Bradley's eyes darted to the horseshoe, then back. "You come to gloat?" "No," Eleanor said. "To return what's yours." The sheriff studied Jacob, seeing not the beast of rumor, but a man standing straight, clean, whole. After a long pause, he sighed. "Judge O'Brien said maybe I was wrong. Maybe the world's bigger than fear lets it be." "It is," she said quietly. "If you let it." He nodded once. "Town's changed some. Folks talk about the woman and the craftsman in the hills. Guess legends beat hangings any day." Jacob extended his hand. Bradley hesitated, then took it. The shake was brief but honest. As they turned to go, the sheriff called after them, voice almost gentle, "Take care of each other." Eleanor smiled. "We've had practice." Back in the valley, the days lengthened. The garden sprouted in neat rows. Beans twined around poles, and corn spears pushed through the soil. Jacob built a small forge behind the shed, the ring of his hammer echoing down the creek. He begun making tools for other settlers, sometimes leaving them at crossroads with no note, just his maker's mark, a simple S burned into the handle. People started calling them stone-home tools, lucky charms of honest work. Eleanor wrote again to Rebecca, short, kind words. I found what I was meant to find. The West is home now. When you see the first wildflowers, think of me. She sealed it, not knowing if the letter would ever reach her sister, but content either way. One evening, thunder rolled over the ridges. They rushed to cover the seedlings with tarps, laughing as rain soaked them through. When it passed, they stood dripping and breathless. The sky split open with sunset. Jacob reached for her, sudden and certain, and kissed her hard. The world stilled around them. No ghost, no chain, only the taste of rain and the warmth of life returning. Eleanor, he whispered, her name a vow. Stay. I will, she answered. Always. Weeks slid into months. The crops rose tall, green as hope. The Winters family visited often. Sarah helped with sowing, Tom with harvest. On Sundays the valley rang with laughter instead of gunfire. Hope toddled through the grass, her giggles chasing away the last of Jacob's shadows. By midsummer, Eleanor felt a change within herself. Quiet first, then undeniable. She waited to be certain before telling him. It was a morning washed in sunlight. Jacob was mending a fence post when she walked up, hands folded over her apron. Jacob, she said softly, I have news. He turned, sensing the tremor in her voice. She smiled through tears. We're going to need that cradle after all. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then his tools dropped, forgotten, and he crossed to her in 3 strides, gathering her close. His laughter came raw, disbelieving, pure. Eleanor, she held his face between her hands. Don't thank me. Just promise me we'll raise this child without fear. Only with truth, he said, and the sound of hammers. They stood there, surrounded by sunlight and the smell of warm earth, the world remade around them. Years later, travelers passing through Cedar Falls spoke of the valley beyond the ridges. They said a craftsman lived there who could mend anything, from plows to hearts, and a woman who could calm storms with her voice. They told of a cabin that glowed at dusk like a lantern, of laughter that echoed even through winter. Some called it legend. Others swore they had seen it themselves. But those who did always spoke of one thing the same way, the feeling that the place remembered kindness. On the lintel above the door of Stonehome hung the polished horseshoe engraved free. Below it, children played. Hope Winters, grown tall, and another younger child with Eleanor's dark hair and Jacob's gray eyes. When visitors asked about the carving, Eleanor would smile. That, she'd say, is what happens when you give mercy a second chance. And if the wind carried their laughter down the valley, mingling with the ring of iron on anvil, it sounded very much like a hymn.